Hello and welcome to the Paintless Studio. Today we're going to talk about Vasari. Have you ever heard of Cappuccino Red Deep? How about the Scott Christensen Grays? And is Vasari really the butteriest paint around? All this and more today on the Paint List. My name's Melissa, I'm a professional painter, and I helped found the Paint List. Vasari is one of the most asked about brands over on the Paint List. Everyone is dying to know, do you really need Cappuccino Red Deep, and do you have to have their Cinnabar Green in order to paint the painting of their dreams? Just for clarity, we are in no way affiliated with Vasari. All of the paint we review is paint that we have purchased ourselves because we just feel like that's what makes a good review. I've been painting with Vasari for years, but I paint with a lot of other brands too. And so one of the things we wanted to do in this video was just to share how Vasari kind of compares and contrasts with some of the other brands that are out there. We're going to talk a little bit about their consistency, their convenience blends, their pigment codes or lack thereof. They also carry some really special pigments that are hard to find anywhere else, like PB33 Genuine Manganese Blue. Vasari is a super buttery paint. Everyone will talk about this brand is so buttery, and do they mean like a stiff peanut butter? Do they mean like a buttercream? When we talk about the most buttery paint, we have to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about what do you mean by buttery? For some people, that's going to be this slick, dripping, almost bouncy quality to the paint. For other people, that's going to be like a rich, creamy, kind of like a buttercream that you can cut through with that palette knife. And then for other people, it's almost like a peanut butter. So when I think of Old Holland, I think of almost like a peanut butter consistency. It's buttery but stiff. So when we're talking about Vasari, it is extremely buttery but gliding. This is paint that is almost slippery sometimes, and it varies a little bit from color to color. Vasari is going to be very easy to use if you're painting in thin layers. It's going to be very helpful if you're working in a controlled environment like the studio where you're not very concerned about maybe some of that paint moving around on a palette like you would be with some other applications like plein air. There's also ways to kind of mitigate some of that extra oil that comes out of the tube naturally with Vasari, like blotting it by putting it on a piece of paper towel and then moving that over onto your palette. With Vasari, you're not going to probably need as many mediums to kind of get in there and modify the paint. With a lot of modern oil paints, there's almost this tacit assumption that a painter is going to add medium to that paint when it comes out of the tube to make it more workable. And with Vasari, sometimes there's even a little extra oil with the paint itself, which makes it very easy to just take a brush to it and start painting. This is also paint that is not recommended, in my opinion, for impasto. That would be a use case where I would say, if you're looking for something that's really sculptable, something with a lot of body, you're going to be kind of working against the consistency of certain Vasari colors. That said, some colors have a little bit more body than others. The high pigmentation is one of the areas that Vasari sets itself apart from other gliding brands of oil paint. I took a look at a couple of different colors and compared them. These are colors with a similar surface appearance so that we wouldn't be thrown off as much by just differences in the hue value chroma of the colors. To take a look at the tinting strength of Vasari, and it performed very well. It's very comparable to Michael Harding, Old Holland, Williamsburg. And the reason in my mind where a painter might choose Vasari is for that consistency. So if you want something that's naturally gliding, naturally more slick, but still very highly pigmented, Vasari is a great choice. Vasari doesn't always put the pigment codes on the tubes. So they do disclose the pigments for most or all of their single pigment colors. Over on the paint list, we've surfaced that pigment information where they provide it. So if you go over there and search for Vasari, that'll pull up all of the Vasari colors, and there you can see which colors actually disclose their pigment codes. Each brand does cadmium colors a little bit differently. The same name, something like cadmium yellow medium, might actually be applied to totally different colors of yellow, depending on the brand. What we want to show is a baseline for comparison. It's never perfect online, but we want to show where a certain brand's cadmiums fall on the spectrum. If a brand says this is cadmium yellow light, well, what kind of yellow is that? While the pigment should be PY35 in a cadmium yellow, that PY35 can be anything from a lemon yellow all the way to kind of a middle yellow, or even maybe warmer than that. With Vasari, we see this interesting pattern where their naming of their cadmium seems to be almost offset one from other brands. Their cadmium yellow medium is actually warm enough to be close to other brands' cadmium yellow deep. So that's just something to be aware of if you're purchasing Vasari cadmiums. The Vasari Cadmiums are beautiful. Their reds are super highly pigmented. They're all very flowing. These are very slick, easy to work with, buttery paints that are going to have a lot of glide. I was a particular fan of their phthalo blues. They have a couple different kinds of phthalo. Their phthalo blue green shade is a very cyan version of phthalo, where their regular phthalo blue is one of the warmer phthalos that I've tested. So that's pushing it more toward that middle blue. Vasari is also famous for their treatment of a particular pigment, PV19. So PV19 is kind of a weird pigment. It has a rose version and a violet version. That ruby violet is actually one of the violetiest violets of the PV19 violets that I've tried, and it actually kind of has an additional note of dusky violet, especially when used in tints. Vasari Cobalt Bright Turquoise is also fairly famous for being a very bright turquoise. They do a really nice job with this color. So overall, they have a stunning lineup of single pigment paints, and the pigments for those are disclosed. You can find all of those listed over on the paint list. Vasari's convenience blends are very famous. Some of their more popular ones are Cappuccine Red Deep, Cinnabar Green Light. They have Video Blue Extra Pale, they have Orchid, they have Ruby Violet Light. They also have a ton of convenience greens. Now, before we get into the convenience blends, I want to share a little bit about my philosophy regarding convenience blends. When I began painting, I started out with a really strict limited palette, and that limited palette is something I would recommend to every beginning and intermediate painter. The reason is it's going to teach a person how to mix color. And if you understand the basics, the fundamental palette colors, that will serve you well for the entirety of your painting career. As I progressed as a painter, I noticed that I was mixing the same blends over and over and using them in specific ways. And so a convenience blend is just a pre-mixed blend that you already know how it works, how you're going to use it, why you use it, and how you want to push and pull that blend. It really speeds things up. And so I've kind of come full circle about convenience blends, to the point that I mixed over 1,000 of my own convenience blends to really understand how these colors work. If you're using a convenience blend, try to understand what it's made of, try to understand how it's working in your process, and if it's something that actually spurs on your painting or makes that process easier for you, that's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about some of their most famous convenience blends. Cappuccine Red Deep, it's the red earth tone you wish you had but doesn't exist. It also makes really nice kind of dull, cool pink middle chroma tints, which are really useful for portraiture. The Cappuccine Red Light was also interesting. I didn't find it quite like it filled a niche on my palette like the Cappuccine Red Deep did. Cappuccine Red Light is actually kind of like a very chromatic red earth. It has maybe a faint, tiny touch of grit. It is actually quite a bit oranger than the Cappuccine Red Deep. Video Blue. This is one of my favorite Vasari colors. I'm a big fan of pre-tinted out convenience blends. Those pre-tinted out colors are really useful because that's one of those things that you find yourself doing over and over again. But I think of it like a phthalo blue that is raised a little higher in lightness with white. Video Blue is actually kind of like a middle cerulean color. If you're familiar with phthalo, it comes out of the tube almost black. This is sort of a middle blue, still somewhat deep. And then the Video Blue Extra Pale raises that dramatically. So this is a very pastel color. Similar to the Video Blue, I got closer when remixing it by adding just a touch of phthalo green, which is interesting. Vasari does tints really well, and I appreciate that because if you have a direct painting method, you're going to be mixing a lot of those colors with white anyhow, and so it's nice to have a convenience blend that already raises the value of some of those colors. I really liked the Orchid, so that's kind of that a little bit cooler purple, as well as the Ruby Violet Light, which is kind of a red purple, and it's a nice kind of addition to the palette. And of course, there are the Scott Christensen grays. Another helpful way to think about a convenience blend is something that grays down a color from its full chroma. So if you're doing a lot of realistic work, kind of reining in that chroma to be more in line with what a person sees, say, out in nature, those can be very time-saving colors. Another area where convenience blends shine is in green. I highly advocate mixing your own greens. I've done this as well with my color mixing project. And I found that their Cinnabar Green Light is actually a really fascinating color. So this is a color that gets some press with certain painters saying, you know, it's like a go-to color. The reason for this, I think, is probably that it's a great foliage green that actually has some complexity to it. It's got like a nice high to middle chroma, but it has so it has like these notes and undertones of being chromatic while not being the highest chroma green that you might mix, say, with a phthalo and a yellow. part of the experience of ordering Vasari is you open up the Vasari box. It has this gorgeous printed top. Inside it has this deep maroon velvet experience. You see the glistening tubes of these beautiful Vasari colors. The first one that comes to mind are the Modern Impressionists. These are really beautiful colors, and they are really lovely and what I would call inspired tints that seem to have that note of Vasari genius in their convenience blends. I really wish that they would list the pigments on those, but these are going to be kind of a spiritual sibling to Gamblin's Radiance series, for instance. And there are a lot of really lovely pastels that will work nicely with a variety of painting subject matter. Some of my favorites in that set are going to be Orchid, their King's Blue, the Video Blue Extra Pale, the Russo Green Extra Pale, and of course their classic Rosebud. Another set that is super famous are the Scott Christensen Grays. These are really quite inspired blends, and if you study Scott Christensen's philosophy, you can learn more about what kind of informs those, but these are really great colors for doing landscape painting. Some of my favorites in the Scott Christensen set are the Bice and the Shale. Bice is a really interesting mid-chroma blue, and Shale is fascinating because while it almost looks like what you might think would be kind of in the brown territory, it has a fascinating red-violet undertone. I also am a big fan of Adobe. Adobe is what a lot of people might think of when they're looking for a yellow ochre, but it's actually a little bit yellower than most yellow ochres. So if you have raw sienna, yellow ochre, and Adobe, it kind of helps fill out that part of the scale for realistic painting. There's also the Renaissance set, really interesting series of tints that are quite high in lightness. And I kind of actually like to set these around my titanium white because they're such delicate colors that you can kind of tint that titanium white in a number of different ways. These are titanium white mixed with some kind of earth tone. There's almost a surprising hint of semi-opacity with a lot of the Vasari convenience colors that I've noticed. So I don't notice it when they're in mass tone, but if you spread them thinly, you can kind of see this little bit of semi-opacity shine through. Because some of their convenience blends don't have the pigment information listed, we can only conjecture, but it does seem that there was perhaps a slight formulation change with Rosebud. We had an older tube of Rosebud from years ago, which we were able to compare to the modern Rosebud, and the older Rosebud was just a little bit warmer, like a little bit more orangey undertone in the red, and just a tiny bit more transparent. It behaved just slightly differently, but the two are very similar. Vasari also has some specialty pigments that you can't really find anywhere else or are very hard to find. And the most beloved of all of these is manganese blue. Years ago, I published an article on how to mix your own manganese blue facsimiles in opaque media. And the manganese blue that is a genuine manganese blue is extremely difficult to completely replicate. Vasari offers this, though bear in mind it does have that rather loose Vasari consistency. What I want to know is, have you painted with Vasari? If so, what do you like about them? Leave a comment below and let us know what your favorite paints are. Together, we can all learn more. Thanks so much for watching, and happy painting.